Hey there, it's the Board Game Bandit with another episode of One Gamer's Journey. This week I'm going to be talking about Ascension, the deck building game, which I often refer to as the forgotten deck building game. For a long time, deck building was my favorite mechanic, and Ascension was partly responsible for the rise and ultimate fall of that mechanic for me. It also has a particularly unfortunate distinction. Out of all the games in my collection, Ascension is probably the game I like best that I may never play again, and this is something I've never had to deal with before. If you remember, until last year, Dominion was my favorite game, and inevitably, every deck builder is going to be compared to it. Ascension was the second deck builder I played. It came out 2 years after Dominion, but still before the industry went big into deck building. I've always believed that Ascension was responsible for creating the lineup-style card row also featured in games like Clank, Star Realms, and the DC deck building game. I'm not 100% certain on whether or not Ascension created the idea, but it certainly popularized it. This was drastically different from Dominion's stack-based approach, but was intriguing enough to try. I remember enjoying Ascension a lot and would even suggest playing it over Dominion from time to time. Not often, but often enough to be noticeable, because I enjoyed the change of pace. Out of my entire collection, approximately 30% of the games are deck builders or expansions for those games. Many of these games are ones I invested heavily in: 8 Dominion entries, 6 Nightfall entries, 9 DC deck building items, the first expansion to Eminent Domain. I'm not even counting Star Realms booster packs. But how many total Ascension entries are there? Just one. The base game. So why the discrepancy? For a long time, Ascension used to be my go-to introduction to deck building game, because in my experience, new players really struggle with the idea of victory point cards in Dominion. Every card in Ascension has value, and while there are starter cards, there are no dead weight cards like an estate, which just takes up space in your hand. It was easy to explain how Ascension is played. The lack of limited actions meant you had an easier time playing your hand, and the cards were more descriptive in their value since each card was worth a certain amount of honor and it was written on the card itself. But as time passed, a problem manifested. Ascension has 49 different cards that could appear in the center row, and each time a card is flipped, every player is going to stop and read it until they know what it does. This slowed the game down tremendously, unlike Dominion, which had only 10 cards, and you wouldn't necessarily buy all 10 of them. This made Dominion technically harder to play, but it had less card text to remember. Was I better off teaching Ascension or Dominion? I began to wonder, and at this point, I had taught both games to a lot of players. As time went on, the industry began to produce what I consider to be objectively better deck-building games that built completely on top of Ascension and began to replace it. The first was a DC Comics deck building game, which added one of my favorite themes on top of my favorite mechanic at the time, and you can imagine how much I played that game. Unfortunately, the DC deck building games have even more card text than Ascension, and each set is mostly standalone, so there's a ton of reading to do, which might explain why 90% of my DC deck plays are with the same 4 or 5 people. Still, the damage was done, and the first nail in the coffin was supplied. I like the DC deck building game better than Ascension. Why is that? My biggest issue with Ascension is that for a game so well designed, it's incredibly short. In fact, the publisher knows this. I played the game so much that my memory told me that the honor spread was 60, 75, or 90, depending on the player count, or 15 honor per player added after 2. But I decided to double check. Sure enough, the PDF rulebook I have on my computer says 30 per player, but that didn't seem right. So I went back to my physical copy and double-checked. Yep, they changed it. My copy clearly says 60, 75, 90 instead of 60, 90, 120. I must have never gotten the errata rulebook. I love the 4 different factions and the idea of constructs versus heroes, but I never felt like my engine was paying off. All you had to do was get power cards and attack monsters, trying to bleed the honor supply dry, and that's not how a deck builder should be played in my opinion. In fact, whenever I would try this strategy, you could bet that monsters would rarely show up and I'd just be killing the cultist over and over again. The brevity helped new players, but it made it very unsatisfying for me after I saw that other deck builders did not have the same problem. Fast forward to 2014 when I ended up getting a free iPad, and I was excited about the idea of playing some games digitally. As ridiculous as this may sound, I have a hard time purchasing digital copies of games I already own, so I was hesitant to purchase duplicates. But then I noticed that there was an Ascension app and that the base game was free. I had to download it, and that was my first iOS game. And the game even let me adjust how much honor I would use as the game's timer. Now that I could adjust the honor, I decided to prove that I felt that the game was too short. I found that when I played with the normal amount of honor at 60 for 2 players, I won about 65 to 75% of the time. When that number was higher, closer to the 120-135 range, I won closer to 95% of the time, which meant to me that the engine simply wasn't sticking around long enough to pay off. No more card text issues, no more short games, and I played that game to death. I would play it for entire lunch breaks. When I had a few minutes to kill, I played Ascension. When I had a few hours to kill on a plane, I played Ascension. I played it everywhere. That is, until I downloaded Star Realms, the final nail in the coffin for Ascension. In my opinion, Star Realms is simply just a better game all around than Ascension. It's only 2 players, but the frustrating brevity of Ascension was replaced with the extreme urgency of kill or be killed in Star Realms. As far as the card text, new players could zero in on 2 colors and ignore the rest entirely. Also, cards had narrower abilities which made them easier to follow. Most cards just added currency, healed you, or did damage. The colors were archetypes, so it was easy to explain that blue heals, yellow discards, etc. For the first time in my gaming career, I truly felt like a game had been replaced and that Ascension had run its course. Even before Star Realms, I hadn't played Ascension since I moved to North Carolina, and it's probably been 5 years since I played it in person. I know my copy has been used by friends, but even that was back in December of 2013. My go-to introductory game is now a game I haven't played physically in 5 years. I know my copy has been used by my friends, but even that was back in December of 2013. That's a long time for a game to go unplayed. So what do? Do I give it to someone else? Or does it just take up space in my closet? It's a game that comes remarkably in a big box for its content, likely due to the fact that Ascension has an unnecessary board. I've only given away 1 game in my life, and it was a game I've owned for 5 years but never played once. I tend to keep my games because they are a piece of my history, but am I denying someone else the chance to enjoy it? This is uncharted territory for me, and I hate when others so callously call their collection. But I truly feel like I'm done with the game. My current high score is 880 because I was able to use the Tablet of Time for several consecutive turns, and I don't see myself buying the expansions because of the onboarding process of teaching players a deck building game. I don't play my other deck building games enough, and I like those even more. I haven't even bought any of the expansions on the digital app. I'll be curious to see what happens a year from now as I look back on this moment. What would you do if you were me? Have you ever felt the game ran its course for you? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for listening. I'm the Board Game Bandit, and our game has just begun.